The air at the Black Hawk County surplus auction hung thick and heavy, a greasy soup of cheap cigar smoke, diesel exhaust, and the sweet, cloying smell of desperation. It was the summer of '71, a time when a man's worth was measured in acres and horsepower, and both were getting dearer by the day. I was there, Jedediah Stone, not looking for a fight, but not one to run from it either. My farm, the one my grandfather broke the sod on with a team of mules, was paid for. Every fence post, every rusty nail in the barn, every acre of black Iowa dirt was mine, free and clear. That fact stuck in the craw of men like Larry Vance. Vance was holding court near the auctioneer's stand, leaning against the fender of his brand-new Ford pickup. He was all flash and credit, a man who believed the bank was a bottomless well. He'd just taken delivery of a John Deere 4030, the paint so fresh you could still smell the factory on it. He saw me looking over the rows of tired, forgotten equipment and sauntered over, a smirk playing on his lips. "Looking for a new planter, Jed?" he drawled, loud enough for the half-dozen farmers around him to hear. "Or maybe just some spare parts for that old museum you call a farm." The laughter was light, but it had an edge. I ignored him, my eyes fixed on the last lot of the day, tucked away behind the road graders and dump trucks. It was an Alice Chalmers HD6E crawler, a bulldozer that looked like it had lost a war. The iconic Persian orange paint was faded to a sad, chalky pink, flaking off in sheets to reveal weeping patches of rust. The blade was bent on the right corner, a permanent, ugly sneer. One of the tracks was thrown, lying limp and disconnected like a broken chain. A greasy sign hung from the radiator guard, hand-painted in sloppy letters, "Sold as is, engine seized." It was 10 tons of scrap iron, a monument to failure. Everyone knew its story. It had belonged to a contractor from Waterloo who'd gone belly up, trying to build a new subdivision on land he couldn't afford. The bank took everything, and this old dozer was the last, most pathetic piece of the wreckage. Vance followed my gaze. "You can't be serious," he scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "That thing's a boat anchor, Jed. They probably had to tow it here. The engine's locked up tighter than a banker's fist on Friday afternoon." I didn't say a word. I walked over to the machine, the dry, cracked earth crunching under my work boots. I ran a calloused hand over the cold steel of the track frame. The undercarriage was worn, sure, but the rollers weren't completely shot. The sprockets had some life left in them. I climbed up onto the track, my boots finding purchase on the grousers, and pulled myself into the operator's seat. The vinyl was split, yellow foam guts spilling out. The levers were stiff with rust and dried grease. But the floor plates weren't rusted through. The frame looked straight. I ignored the whispers and the snickers from Vance's crowd. I was listening to the machine. A piece of equipment like this has a story, if you know how to read it. I looked at the engine. It was the Alice Chalmers 6000, a tough, direct-injection diesel. The story was that the operator had run it low on oil and thrown a rod right through the block. But I saw something else. I saw clean bolts on the injector pump. I saw a fuel filter that looked like it had been changed recently. And I saw a faint, dark stain weeping from the head gasket right above the number 4 cylinder. That told a different story. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Fitz, finally got to the last lot. "All right, folks, here she is, a genuine Alice Chalmers HD6E. She ain't pretty, but she's heavy. What am I bid for this fine piece of yard art? Do I hear $50? $50 to haul her home for scrap?" A man from the scrapyard raised a lazy finger. "50. I got 50. Do I hear 75? $75? Silence. The scrap man was going to get it for a song. $100, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the auction chatter like a hot knife through butter. Every head turned. Fitz's eyes widened in surprise. Vance actually laughed out loud, a sharp, barking sound. "Jed, what in God's name are you going to do with that thing?" he called out. "Use it as a scarecrow." $100 from Mr. Stone, Fitz chirped, getting back into his rhythm. "Do I hear 125? 125 from the scrap man." The scrap dealer just shook his head and spit a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. He wasn't going to bid against a farmer who was clearly touched in the head. "Sold," Fitz slammed his gavel down, "for $100, to the man who ain't afraid of a little hard work. Jed Stone." The crowd parted as I walked up to pay Fitz his money. I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of pity and amusement. As I counted out 5 worn $20 bills from my wallet, Vance clapped me on the shoulder a little too hard. "You're a stubborn fool, Jed," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, but still loud enough for his buddies to hear. "While you're wasting your summer trying to resurrect that corpse, I'll be clearing another 40 acres with my new deer. That's how you make money in this business. You spend money to make money. You gotta get with the times." I pocketed my receipt and looked him square in the eye. "I prefer to make money with my hands, Larry, not with the banks." I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there with his smirk and his audience. I had a 10-ton problem to get home and a feeling deep in my gut that this $100 gamble was about more than just a broken-down machine. It was about survival. Before we go any further, before I even get a wrench on this thing, I have to ask you all a question. Have you ever taken a chance on something everyone else called junk? A rusty old truck, a forgotten tool, a piece of land nobody wanted? Tell me in the comments below about the time you turned someone else's trash into your own treasure. I'd genuinely like to hear it. All right, let's get back to the story. Getting the HD6 home was the first battle. It cost me another $75, cash I'd earmarked for seed corn, to get a local hauler with a lowboy trailer to move it the 12 miles to my farm. He grumbled the whole time, complaining about the thrown track and the dead weight. When he finally backed it into my yard, winching it off the trailer with a groan of protesting steel, it looked even worse sitting next to my barn than it had at the auction. It sat there, listing to one side, a monument to my supposed foolishness. For the first week, I did nothing but look at it. I'd finish my chores, pour a cup of coffee, and just walk circles around the big Alice, letting it talk to me. The neighbors would slow their pickups as they drove by, shaking their heads. I could hear the talk down at the co-op, I'm sure. Jed Stones finally cracked. Bought the old contractor's boat anchor. Let them talk. Talk is cheap. Wrenches and sweat are what get things done. The second week, the work began. The first order of business was that seized engine. Everyone assumed it was a thrown rod, a catastrophic failure. But my gut told me different. I started by draining the oil. It was black and thick, but I strained every drop through a cheesecloth. I found sludge, but no metal shavings, no big chunks of bearing, no pieces of a piston skirt. That was the first good sign. A thrown rod would have filled the pan with shrapnel. Next, I pulled the injectors. They were filthy, the tips caked with carbon. I took them into my workshop, a place that smelled of oiled steel and patience, and carefully disassembled them on my bench. 3 of them were salvageable, but the one from the number 4 cylinder was completely seized. The needle valve was frozen solid. That was another clue. A stuck-open injector can pour raw fuel into a cylinder, washing the oil off the walls and, if you're unlucky, filling the cylinder with so much liquid diesel that the piston can't complete its stroke. They call it hydrolock. It'll stop an engine dead, just like a thrown rod, but without destroying the whole bottom end. The real work was pulling the head. The bolts were rusted tight, and I had to soak them in penetrating oil for 2 days. I put a 4-foot breaker bar on my socket wrench, and the sound of the first bolt groaning and finally letting go echoed across the yard. One by one, they gave way, each a small victory. With my engine hoist, I carefully lifted the massive cast-iron head off the block. And there it was. The truth laid bare. The number 4 cylinder was full of diesel fuel. The piston was stopped just short of top dead center. There were no score marks on the cylinder wall, no sign of a catastrophic impact. The dark stain I'd seen on the outside of the block corresponded perfectly with a blown section of the head gasket, right between the cylinder and a coolant passage. My theory firmed up. The injector stuck open, flooding the cylinder. The pressure blew the weakest point, the head gasket, and the engine locked up. The operator, assuming the worst, just walked away. The contractor, already in financial trouble, didn't bother having a mechanic look at it. The bank, seeing a non-running machine, wrote it off. It was a chain of assumptions, and I had just broken it. I spent the next month on that engine. I had the head magna fluxed at a machine shop in Waterloo. No cracks. They planed it flat for me for $20. I found a new old stock head gasket and a single rebuilt injector from a salvage yard over in Mason City. I honed the cylinder walls by hand, the rhythmic scrape of the tool a meditation. I cleaned the carbon off the piston heads until I could see the original markings. I relapped the valves, grinding them into their seats with a patience that was as much a part of me as the grease under my fingernails. All the while, the world kept turning. Larry Vance would drive by in his air-conditioned pickup, a cloud of dust in his wake. He'd bought another 80 acres bordering my south fence line. He'd torn out the old fence with his new deer, leaving a scar of raw earth. He was farming fence row to fence row, the modern way. He stopped one afternoon while I was talking down the headbolts. "Still playing with your toys, Jed?" he shouted over the wind. I just wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of a greasy hand and gave him a nod. "You know," he continued, leaning on his door, "the Farm Bureau guy was telling me land prices are going to go through the roof. The Russians are buying grain like it's going out of style. You should be leveraging that paid-for land of yours. Buy up some more ground before it's too late. A guy like you, with no debt, the bank would be begging to give you a loan." "I'm fine right where I am, Larry," I said, turning my attention back to the torque wrench. He shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "You're going to get left behind, Jed. This is the new age of farming. Get big or get out. You can't make a living on 200 acres with 30-year-old equipment anymore." He drove off, leaving me in his dust. Maybe he was right. But debt felt like a chain to me, and I'd rather be a free man on a small farm than a king who owed his soul to the bank. The day finally came. The engine was back together, fresh oil in the pan, fresh diesel in the tank. I bled the fuel lines, cracking each one open until a clear stream of fuel squirted out, no air bubbles. I hooked up 2 heavy-duty truck batteries. I took a deep breath, the smell of fresh paint on the valve cover mixing with the scent of old iron. I climbed into the cracked seat, turned the key and pushed the starter button. The starter motor whined, a high-pitched protest, as it tried to turn over the big diesel. The engine turned slowly, then a little faster. Chug, chug, chug. A puff of white smoke coughed from the exhaust stack. Then another. I gave it a little throttle. Chug, 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 chug. And then it happened. A deep, guttural bark, followed by a cloud of black smoke that blotted out the sun. The engine caught. The slow, rhythmic chugging erupted into a deafening, clattering roar. The whole machine vibrated, the steel deck humming under my boots. The sound of that Alice Chalmers 6000 diesel coming to life was the sweetest music I had ever heard. It wasn't just an engine running, it was a resurrection. It was proof. I let it run for a minute, the smoke clearing, the engine settling into a steady, powerful idle. I looked across my fields, toward Vance's property. He could keep his quiet, new tractors. I'd take this noise. This was the sound of victory. The next few years seemed to prove Larry Vance right and me wrong. The early 70s were a boom time for American agriculture like no one had ever seen. The massive grain sales to the Soviet Union sent corn and soybean prices into the stratosphere. Land values doubled, then tripled. The government was encouraging us to plant every square inch we could, and the banks were throwing money at farmers with an almost reckless abandon. The phrase on everyone's lips, straight from the Secretary of Agriculture, was "plant fence row to fence row." Larry Vance became the poster child for the new prosperity. He used his initial 80-acre expansion as collateral for a loan to buy a full quarter section, 160 acres, of prime bottomland that came up for sale when Old Man Hemmings passed away. He didn't stop there. He leased another 200 acres. His operations swelled from a modest family farm to a sprawling enterprise of nearly 600 acres. His machinery got bigger and shinier with each passing year. The John Deere 4030 was traded in for a massive International Harvester 1066, its black-striped side panels a symbol of modern power. He bought a 6-row corn planter and a Gleaner combine with an air-conditioned cab and a radio. He built a new Morton machine shed that dwarfed my old hip-roof barn. He and his wife built a new brick ranch-style house on a hill overlooking their land, with a 2-car garage and a paved driveway. To everyone in Black Hawk County, Larry Vance was a genius, a visionary who had seized the moment. Meanwhile, I kept my head down. That old HD6E became my primary tool for improvement, not expansion. The boom years were good to me too. The high grain prices meant I had extra money in my pocket for the first time in a long while. But instead of leveraging it for more land, I invested it back into the land I already owned. I used the dozer to do the work no one else wanted to do, the work that didn't show up on a balance sheet right away. I spent a whole fall clearing the 20-acre woodlot on the back end of my property, a tangle of scrub oak and buckthorn that had been useless for a century. The Alice was a monster. I learned its balance, the way to use the corner of the blade to pop a stubborn stump, the feel of the engine loading up as I pushed a wall of earth. I piled the trees and brush, and in the cold, clear nights of November, the bonfires lit up the sky. By spring, I had 20 new acres of rich black soil, ready for the plow. I didn't buy more land, I made more. On my rolling hills, I used the dozer to build terraces. It was slow, painstaking work, carving long, graceful contours into the slopes to stop the erosion that stole my topsoil with every heavy rain. Vance and the others just plowed right up and down the hills, fast and easy, but I'd watch sheets of my neighbor's best soil wash down into the ditches after a thunderstorm. While they were losing their farms by the spoonful, I was anchoring mine to the bedrock. I dug drainage ditches, tiled low spots that had always been too wet to plant, and cleared old stone fence lines that had been put there by my great-grandfather. Every improvement was paid for in cash with my own sweat and the fuel I put in that old dozer. The community's perception of me shifted from pity to a kind of confused disdain. I was no longer the fool who bought the boat anchor. I was the fool who was sitting on a gold mine and refusing to dig. The talk at the diner was always the same. "Jed, old man Peterson is looking to sell his 80 next to you. You could pick it up for a song," one of them would say. "The bank's offering operating loans at 6%. 6%. It's practically free money," another would add. Vance, now a big shot who sat on the co-op board, would just smile and shake his head. "Jed's got his own way of doing things," he'd say, the condescension thick in his voice. "Some people are just afraid of success." I never argued. I just paid for my coffee and went back to work. I saw the loan documents on the bankers' desks. I saw the new equipment lining my neighbors' driveways. And I saw the interest rates, which had started to creep up. 6% became 7. 7 became 8.5. The news on the radio was all about inflation. A man named Paul Volcker was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, and he was talking tough about whipping inflation, no matter the cost. One evening in the late summer of '78, I was sitting on my porch watching a heat-lightning storm flicker on the horizon. The air was thick and still. I'd just finished rebuilding one of the final drives on the HD6, a greasy, heavy job that had taken me 3 days. My hands ached, but it was a good ache. A letter from the bank lay on the table next to me. It wasn't a bill. I had no loans with them other than my small seasonal operating note, which I paid off every fall. It was a promotional letter, pre-approved, offering me a line of credit for $250,000 secured by my farm. "Use it to expand, to modernize, to realize your farm's full potential," it read. I looked across the valley at the lights of Larry Vance's new house, shining like a beacon of prosperity. He was the farm's full potential, according to the letter. He had it all. But as I watched the silent, distant flashes of lightning, I couldn't shake a cold feeling in the pit of my stomach. The storm was still far away, but I could smell the rain on the wind. And I knew that when it finally broke, it wouldn't matter how big your machine shed was. The only thing that would matter was how deep your roots were. I crumpled the bank's letter in my fist and tossed it into the trash. The real storm was coming. The boom years were a fever, and for a while it seemed like the heat would never break. The price of corn flirted with $3 a bushel, a number that would have been pure fantasy just a decade earlier. But fevers always break. The first chill came not from the sky, but from the radio. In the winter of 1980, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter announced a grain embargo. The primary customer for America's agricultural bounty was suddenly cut off. The market, which had seemed like a bottomless well, was capped overnight. Prices didn't just fall, they plummeted. That spring the sky turned against us too. The rain simply stopped. The clouds that gathered on the horizon were thin and wispy, promising nothing. By June, the corn was stunted, the leaves curling in on themselves by midday to conserve what little moisture they could find. The ground, That rich black Iowa soil turned to concrete and then to dust. The wind, which always blew across the plains, now picked up the topsoil from the vast, unprotected fields of my neighbors and threw it against my fence lines, piling it up in brown drifts. The terraces I had carved with the old Alice held my farm in place, each contour a dam against the slow-motion disaster. I saw the first real crack in Larry Vance's empire one blistering afternoon in July. I was cultivating my soybeans, my old Farmall M chugging along steadily, when I saw his massive International 1066 sitting dead in the middle of his field, a pillar of silent red steel in a sea of withered corn. A service truck from the dealership in Waterloo was parked beside it. I watched for an hour as two mechanics in clean coveralls swarmed over the machine. They pulled the transmission, a job that required a heavy A-frame and chain hoists. Even from a quarter-mile away, I could see the shake of the head, the frustrated gestures. They eventually loaded the guts of the machine onto their truck and drove away, leaving the crippled tractor sitting in the field like a tombstone. It sat there for 2 weeks. The bill for a factory-rebuilt transmission and the labor to install it, I later heard, was over $5,000. That was more than a good used tractor cost just a few years before. It was money Vance didn't have. The corn wasn't going to make a crop, and the bank was no longer smiling and handing out cash. He had to sell a small herd of feeder cattle he was raising, sell them at a loss into a flooded market just to get his main tractor running again. The pressure was beginning to show on his face. The easy smirk was gone, replaced by a permanent tight-lipped frown. His shoulders, which had always seemed so broad and confident, were now slumped. We passed each other on the gravel road one day. He was in his fancy pickup, me in my rusty old Chevy. He slowed, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something, maybe even ask for help. But then he just gave a curt, bitter nod and sped away, kicking up a plume of dust that settled all over my clean windshield. He was a man on a high wire, and the wind had started to blow. The rest of us, we just watched and waited for the fall. I took no pleasure in it. It was like watching a man drown in a flood he'd prayed for. The fall of 1981 was a season of ghosts. The harvest was a bitter, dusty affair, with yields cut by more than half from the drought. The corn dryers sat silent, and the grain bins were mostly empty. The low yields and rock-bottom prices were a body blow, but the knockout punch came from the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker, true to his word, cranked interest rates up to levels not seen in living memory. The prime rate soared past 20%. For farmers like Larry Vance, who had built their empires on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His operating notes, his equipment loans, his mortgages, the interest payments alone were now more than the entire farm could gross in a good year, and this was the worst of years. The auction notices started appearing in the paper like obituaries. First, the young guys, the ones who had jumped in with both feet, borrowing heavily to get started. Then the established farmers, men who had been on their land for generations but had gotten caught up in the expansion fever. White signs with black lettering sprouted at the ends of gravel driveways all over the county. It was a plague. The sound of the auctioneer's chant became the soundtrack of our ruin. I survived by being small, by being invisible to the bankers. My only debt was my property tax bill, and the meager harvest was enough to cover that and buy groceries for the winter. The HD6 sat parked by the barn, its work of building and fortifying done. Now its value was in its silence, in the fact that it demanded nothing from me. It didn't have a payment book. It didn't need a dealer to fix it. It was mine, a 10-ton anchor of iron and solvency in a sea of debt. I spent that winter in my shop, overhauling the engine on my old Farmall, patching the rust on my pickup, and living on the canned goods my wife had put up from her garden. We were poor, but we were free. The inevitable day came for Larry Vance in the spring of '82. The auction sign went up at the end of his new paved driveway, the stark lettering a final cruel insult to the dream he had built. The sale was on a cold, grey Saturday in March. The wind had a bitter edge to it, whipping across the bare fields. Half the county was there, not to gloat, but to bear witness, to see the final chapter of the man who had flown closest to the sun. They came in their worn-out work coats and muddy boots, their faces grim, knowing it could just as easily be them. The auctioneer set up on a flatbed trailer in front of the massive machine shed. Vance's equipment was lined up in neat, heartbreaking rows: the Gleaner combine, the 6-row planter, the big chisel plow. Everything looked brand new, the paint still glossy, the tires still showing the little rubber nubs from the factory. It was the best fleet of iron in the county, and it was being sold for pennies on the dollar to satisfy the bank. I saw Larry standing off to one side with his wife near the brick house they were about to lose. He looked like a stranger in his own yard. His face was pale and hollowed out. He wasn't watching the auction, he was just staring at the horizon, at the land that was no longer his. His wife was crying silently, her arm linked through his, the only thing holding him up. The auctioneer moved down the line to the big International 1066, the tractor he'd been so proud of. It was his crown jewel. All right, folks, here she is, a real powerhouse, a late model 1066 with low hours. What'll you give, boys? Let's start the bidding at $10,000. 10,000. Silence. In a normal year, it would have brought twice that. But these weren't normal years. No one had cash and no one could get credit. The only person bidding was a man in a suit from the bank, trying to protect their investment. He bid 5,000. The auctioneer tried to work the crowd, his voice getting more desperate. 5,000 is all I got. Boys, you're stealing it. This is the best tractor in the county. He looked right at me. Everyone knew I was one of the few with no debt. My neighbors turned to look, their eyes full of a strange mixture of hope and resentment. They wanted to see someone besides the bank win, but the fact that I could afford to, while they couldn't, was a bitter pill. I just shook my head. I didn't need a tractor that big, and I wouldn't have taken it if they gave it to me. It represented a way of farming, a way of thinking, that had proven to be a trap. The banker got it for his opening bid. One by one, Vance's dreams were dismantled and sold off to the cold, impartial logic of the numbers in a ledger. The last things to be sold were the parcels of land. The banker from Waterloo bought the new house and the quarter section of bottomland. The leased ground reverted to its owners. All that was left was the original 80 acres he had bought from the Hemmings estate, the parcel that bordered my south fence line. It was the first piece he had bought in his quest to get big. Now it was the last piece to go. The auctioneer described the parcel. 80 acres more or less. Prime farmland, lays flat. What am I bid per acre? The banker started it off low, at $500 an acre. No one else said a word. It was going to go to the bank, just like everything else. I thought about that land. I thought about Vance tearing out the old fence line, leaving that scar. I thought about my great-grandfather's stones that probably still lay buried under the soil. And I thought about Larry standing there like a ghost, watching the last piece of his life get auctioned away. 600, I said. My voice was steady. A murmur went through the crowd. The banker, annoyed, immediately bid 650. 700, I said, without hesitating. The banker glared at me. He was used to getting his way at these sales. He conferred with another man in a suit, then bid 750. He was probably near the limit the bank had authorized him to bid. $1,000 an acre, I said, my voice carrying clear and strong on the cold wind. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a fortune, far more than the land was worth in that depressed market. But it was less than it would be worth when times got better, and I knew times would eventually get better. More importantly, it was cash. My cash. Earned with my hands, saved through years of quiet, stubborn work. The banker was stunned. He shook his head and waved his hand at the auctioneer in disgust. He was done. Sold, the auctioneer cried, slamming his hand down on his ledger. For $1,000 an acre, to Jedediah Stone. I didn't look at the crowd. I walked over to the clerk's table to sign the papers, my hand steady. As I was finishing, I felt a presence beside me. It was Larry Vance. His eyes were red-rimmed, but for the first time that day, they were clear. "Jed," he said, his voice raspy. "Why? You paid too much." I capped my pen and stood up to face him. I was a few inches shorter, but on that day I felt like I stood on higher ground. "The land is worth what it's worth, Larry," I said quietly. "But a neighbor's dignity, that's priceless. You drove yourself into the ground trying to feed the world. There's no shame in that. The shame is in the system that encouraged you to do it and then broke you. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He didn't understand. I'll need someone to work that 80 for me, I continued. I'm getting too old to handle another parcel by myself. I'll be leasing it out. I'd like you to have the first refusal. On shares. We'll split the crop 60-40. Your favor. Tears welled in his eyes and streamed down his weathered cheeks. This man who had once mocked me, who had pitied my old-fashioned ways, was utterly broken and rebuilt in that single moment. He tried to speak, but no words came out. He just nodded, a convulsive, desperate motion. He reached out and shook my hand. His grip was limp, the grip of a defeated man, but as he held on, I could feel a little bit of strength returning to it. I had bought his land, but I had given him back a piece of his life. That was the real victory. Not in being right, but in being there to catch a neighbor when he fell. The years that followed were lean, but they were good. The farm crisis slowly receded, and a new, more cautious equilibrium settled over the heartland. Larry and I became partners on that 80-acre field. He used my old equipment, the machines he had once scorned, and he farmed with a newfound humility and care. We never spoke of the auction again, but a quiet, profound respect grew between us. He taught my son how to run a combine, and I helped him fix the roof on the small house he rented in town. The community, which had once been divided into the camps of progress and the past, came to see that the real wisdom lay somewhere in between. They saw that the foundation was more important than the height of the building. I never got big. My farm remained the same 200 acres my grandfather had worked, plus the 80 I bought from the bank that day. But it was all mine, and it was healthy. The terraces held, the soil grew richer, and the farm provided. The old HD6E Dozer became a landmark, parked in honorable retirement by the barn. Its Persian orange paint was almost completely gone, faded to a uniform coat of rust and primer, a testament to years of hard work. The engine still turned over, but its main job now was to serve as a jungle gym for my grandchildren. One warm summer evening, years later, my oldest grandson, a boy of 10 with my same stubborn chin, climbed up into the operator's seat. I was sitting on the porch, watching him, my joints aching with the familiar pain of a life spent in labor. "Grandpa," he called out, "did you really get this thing running all by yourself?" "I did," I called back. "And you built all those terraces with it?" "Every single one." He was quiet for a moment, his small hands on the big, stiff levers. Then he asked the question that mattered most. "Why didn't you buy a new one, Grandpa, like everyone else?" I pushed myself out of my chair and walked slowly over to the old machine. The grass cool under my worn boots. I leaned against the warm steel of the track, the metal holding the last heat of the day. "Because this machine," I said, patting the fender, "taught me the most important lesson a farmer can ever learn. It's not about how much you can grow, or how much land you can own, or how shiny your equipment is. It's about what you owe. This Dozer doesn't have a banker's name on the title. It's just ours. Debt, son, is a landlord you can never fire. It will take your crop, it will take your land, and in the end, it will take your soul. Everything you see here, this land, this barn, this house, it's free and clear. It's ours. And because of that, we're free too." He looked at me, his young eyes trying to grasp the weight of my words. He wouldn't understand it all today, but I had planted the seed. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the worn original key and handed it to him. "Turn it over," I said with a smile. "Let's hear her run." He fit the key into the ignition, he pushed the starter button. The engine whined, churned, and then with a great cloud of black smoke and a deafening roar, the old Alice Chalmers 6000 diesel coughed back to life. The sound echoed across the valley, a deep, rumbling testament to survival, a promise passed from one generation to the next. It was the sound of home.